Last week, there was a massive military parade in the Chinese capital Beijing. It happened on the 2nd of September, which is a historic date. On that day, the Japanese forces in China surrendered, marking the end of a war that started in 1937. But there is something strange going on, because China doesn't tell the full story. Who actually did defeat the Japanese in China, and how does this dissonance now extend to the Taiwan question? China commemorated the end of World War II in Asia 80 years ago with the largest military parade in the country's history. Tens of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of army vehicles, tanks, aircraft and helicopters took part in the parade. Many weapon systems were also in display during the parade, some for the first time. Chinese leader Xi Jinping was flanked on the stage by Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Due to their presence, no Western leaders were in attendance. But there is something strange going on, because it seemed the role of the communists during the Second World War was now much bigger than it was a couple of years ago. Where the Second World War is named the Great Patriotic War in Russia and in many former USSR countries, in China the war is called the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and World War against fascism. For the Chinese Communist Party, the victory over Japan is an important part in the history of modern China and the party itself. The event is widely publicized within the propaganda apparatus. I remember when I visited China back in 2016, there were historical-ish action movies on display in the Chinese metro. Among the Chinese people, the parade is intended to stir up feelings of national pride, loyalty and combativeness. The Communist Party wants other countries to recognize that China made many sacrifices for the end of World War II. However, the country presents its contribution as greater than historical reality justifies. So, what was China's role in World War II? Was it just a sideshow or much more? Already long before World War II, China had seen action against Japan. When China was still under the Qing dynasty, the Japanese got the upper hand during the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894-1895, which ended with an unequal treaty for China. The defeat was one out of many in what in China is known as the Century of Humiliation. The following confrontation came in 1931 after the Mukden incident, which was a false flag operation staged by the Japanese military. The Japanese invaded and occupied Manchuria, after which they made it a puppet state named Manchukuo. A full-scale Japanese invasion would follow in 1937 after the Marco Polo Bridge incident had taken place. Now, before continuing this story, I must note that the Japanese invasion interrupted another conflict that was going on in China at that time, the Chinese Civil War. This was a prolonged struggle for power in China between the Communist Party of China, the CCP, and the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, or KMT, that had kicked off in 1927. The conflict was interrupted when both the Nationalists and the Communists united to fight the invading Japanese forces. When Japan invaded, many Japanese believed it was going to be a walk in the park. Having defeated China decades ago, and finding a country amidst a civil war, they didn't expect much resistance. But they were wrong. The battle for the coastal city of Shanghai alone lasted many bloody months. The capture of the city opened the road to the then capital of China, Nanking or Nanjing. It was there where the Chinese bore the brunt of the Japanese wartime barbarity.
After a battle lasting but a few days, the city fell to the invaders. In their occupation of Nanking, the Japs again outdid themselves in barbarism. the helpless populace was trapped by the city walls and could not flee. The Japanese soldiers went berserk. They raped and tortured. They killed and butchered.
During the 1937 Nanjing massacre, hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and POWs were murdered, and many women became victims of sexual abuse. Other crimes included torture, looting, and arson. The massacre is considered one of the worst wartime atrocities in history, an event that in today's Japan can be met with a great deal of denialism. Then there was the case of Unit 731, infamous for its human experimentation during its existence during the Japanese occupation, in which thousands perished. The Japanese occupation and war are estimated to have cost the lives of 15 to 20 million Chinese. In the historiography of the Chinese Communist Party, Japan's surrender is a turning point for China. For the first time in modern history, China had defeated a foreign occupier. The communists then rebuilt the country, something the current regime calls the resurrection. China returned to its former prosperity and prominent place on the world stage, it says. But what is missing from this story is that the communists were not solely responsible for Japan's defeat. In 1945, China was still in the midst of a civil war between the communists under Mao and the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek, who later fled to Taiwan. And the nationalist forces did most of the fighting against Japan. The communists mostly operated behind enemy lines. And after Japan's surrender, the communists also seized much of the Japanese weaponry with which they continued the Chinese Civil War. It was not until 1949 that Mao won the Civil War, leaving the nationalists in control of only Taiwan. Rana Mitter, historian and China expert at Harvard Kennedy School and writer of the book China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism, points out the Chinese Communist Party played a leading role, but not the leading role. He points out that it was a victory for the communists, nationalists, and the Americans together, but there is hardly any room in China for the role of the other victors, whereas the role of the nationalists was still emphasized during the commemoration of 2015, it now seems to have been erased from the history books. China also uses the victory over Japan to reinforce its role within the UN. Chinese leaders regularly emphasize that their country was one of the first signatories of the UN Charter. What they don't mention is that most of the Chinese signatories were nationalists, the opponents of the Communist Party. China invests in the UN in word and deed. It is a major financial contributor, works closely with southern countries, and Chinese delegates increasingly hold leadership positions. China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council and contributes a relatively large number of troops to UN security missions. Chinese blue helmets therefore also march in the parade, just as they did 10 years ago. According to China expert Mitter, China uses all these elements to present itself as the guardian of world peace, in contrast to the US, which he claims undermines that same order. During World War II, the United States supported China in several ways, most notably through the Land-Lease program, initiated by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The program allowed Washington to supply weapons, equipment, and other resources to nations resisting Axis aggression, without requiring immediate payment. Repayment was expected later. China was among the key beneficiaries, receiving around $700 million in military assistance before Japan's surrender in 1945, according to the 1946 State Department memo. Aid continued briefly afterward. In total, nearly $49 billion in land-lease supplies went to about 40 countries worldwide. Beyond material aid, American volunteers, famously the Flying Tigers, helped China's defense by taking on Japan's air force. After the Pearl Harbor attack in late 1941, Roosevelt also dispatched General Joseph Stilwell to act as a military advisor to the Chinese leadership. In 1945, the US dropped 2 atom bombs on Japan, after which the land of the rising sun surrendered, which ended the Second World War in Asia. As a former victim of foreign oppression, China believes it has a moral claim to position itself as the leader of an alternative world order, a world order in which China has more to say than the West, whether it concerns trade, disputes, territorial disputes, or human rights issues. According to Mitter, it is understandable that China wants more recognition for its role in ending World War II. Nevertheless, he sees a problem in the way the memory of the war and its millions of dead is being used to claim political and strategic power. China is using this power primarily to achieve its goals for 2049, when the centenary of the People's Republic of China will be celebrated. China's return as an absolute power and, according to some analysts, reunification with Taiwan. And this brings us to the thorny issue of Taiwan. China claims Taiwan on the basis of its One China principle, which asserts that Taiwan had been an inseparable part of China since ancient times. Beijing argues that after Japan's defeat in 1945, Taiwan was restored to Chinese sovereignty, and that the island's later separation during the Chinese Civil War, when the nationalists retreated there in 1949, does not negate this status. The Communist Party framed reunification as essential to completing China's national rejuvenation and overcoming past humiliations. From Beijing's perspective, Taiwan's independence movements challenge its territorial integrity, and reunification is both a historical duty and political necessity.